Right, it's time for us to have a look at the stories that are making headlines around the world this morning. This is where I need a bit of extra help. And The Independent follows suit with many of the world's papers by looking at the funeral of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
El País says the Spanish government acknowledged Venezuelan election results after previously demanding a recount.
Now, Greece's poor are really struggling to survive, with many children going hungry to school. The International Herald Tribune says savings have been used up and the economy is now in free fall.
Today's Daily Telegraph's business section looks at how Apple shares dropped below $400 after one of its suppliers posted disappointing results.
Well, we have Rolake Akinkugbe here with us. She's the head of energy research at EcoBank. Good morning, Rolake. Nice to see you. Now, yesterday, I mean, it was a huge national event, and to reflect that fact, so many of the British papers today have got what they're calling souvenir editions, but we're particularly looking at The Independent with a very graphic and very, well, it's a lovely picture, isn't it? But yeah, tells the story.
It is. You call it a huge national event. I would say that's probably an understatement. I mean, many people are saying it was essentially a state funeral in all but name. And it comes with all that pomp and circumstances that you would, and certainly even international observers would associate with sort of grand British events. And sort of reminds me of the royal wedding. And one of the interesting things is not since 1965, when Winston Churchill was buried, has the Queen attended a funeral of a former Prime Minister. So this is quite significant, and there were some very interesting elements as well.
But did you appreciate the pomp and the circumstance, the way in which is quintessentially British? Would you have said so?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's quintessentially British, and then, you know, what, of course, St. Paul's Cathedral, what else could be more quintessentially British? I think what was interesting, the thing about it was also the people who attended. 170 countries were represented, and however much you think about Thatcher's policies, the fact is actually in her death, she actually unified quite a wide spectrum of people around the world. Yeah.
Now let's have a look at some other papers and what they're covering today. A major broadsheet in Spain, El País, widely read: Spain draws line and a vote recount spat with Venezuela. Talking about the fact that, you know, Madrid was sort of saying earlier this week, we want to see a recount. Do you think, you know, Venezuela's bothered or listening?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, former colony Spain, the interesting thing here is that Venezuela had recalled the Spanish ambassador, actually. And the problem here is that Spain has actually jumped ahead of the EU in essentially endorsing Maduro's election. The problem is very tight race between Maduro and the opposition. There were some protests, but I suspect this will probably just fetter out after a couple of weeks.
Now, I know you know Nigeria exceedingly well. Do you think it's a good idea for a former colonial power to be intervening in the first place?
Well, I think one of the considerations here is, do you prioritize stability over potential protests and uncertainty going forward? And certainly Venezuela is an important oil producer, so that's a factor.
International Herald Tribune, a really poignant story about how tough things are in Greece for people, and it focuses on children going to school hungry. It talks about one little boy who's just racked with pain. He's so hungry at school, and when the family were quizzed about it, they just had to admit they'd run out of savings. They were trying to survive. They were living on pasta and tomato ketchup.
I mean, this is a really sad story beyond the headlines about the Eurozone crisis. This is how it actually affects people right at the bottom of the ladder. Unemployment levels in Greece are now at 29%, the highest in the entire EU zone. And this is quite significant. So we were talking about real poverty. I mean, we'd seen stories in the past about people queuing for handouts and food. And this is really a reflection of what is going on a much more larger scale, I think, than we actually know about. And it's really sad that it's affecting children and the very vulnerable.
How do you think the balance in terms of the debate is going with regard to austerity and cutting of deficits versus growth and stimulating
Well, it's
the economy?
a difficult question, a different dilemma for policymakers in any country. You have to strike a real balance, and you think about what you have to give up in order to save for long-term sustainable growth. Unfortunately, there needs to be cushion effects that will make it easier for the economy to bear the brunt of some of these measures. And we're actually starting to see it in a very real way. And the question is, what is the government doing to support those right at the bottom of the ladder?
OK, difficult one. Now, Apple. Its shares were at a peak in September 2011, cost over $700 to get an Apple share then. Yesterday, they dipped below $400 for the first time in quite some time, but they closed a little bit higher than $400.
I mean, this is...
Give us, you know, I mean, we all watch these things like a hawk, those of us who are in business and we're sort of, you know, market geeks.
Yeah,
give us your take on it.
I mean, this is really a case of whetting people's appetite. As a technology company, you have to keep innovating. If you're not innovating, your consumers get worried. There's also a big issue of demand in China, and we obviously know the East are big consumers of technology and especially Apple products. And as a consumer, if you expected a new model of a phone to come out, you'd hold off spending now and just wait till the future.
It's interesting though, because one of the reasons why the shares went down is because one of Apple's suppliers was talking about the fact that it's not got as many orders coming in, it's got a bit of an inventory issue going on, and we've got a few suppliers saying the same thing.
And that is a really interesting thing, because it shows how sensitive the markets are right now, and I think it also reflects a broader global economic climate around demand.
And this is the case, I mean, you're also, one of your main stories today is Nokia, isn't it? I mean, this seems to have been the problem that's really blighted the fortunes of Nokia as another company, because they haven't kept up with their research and development, they haven't kept up with the technology.
Absolutely, and it might be an opportunity for others to come in and innovate in the short term whilst Apple is going through this very challenging time financially.
But of course the only way for Apple is down. When you're the most valuable company in the world, there's only one direction to go in, isn't there? Really quickly, we didn't highlight it specifically, but apparently taxi drivers are being urged to get training in China. South China Morning Post. What are they up to over there? Should we be concerned if we get in a taxi in Beijing?
I mean, this is really interesting, because I know some parts of the world where taxi drivers are actually given mental tests when they violate traffic offences. I wouldn't mention the country, but essentially this is compulsory training courses. From a safety point of view, this is quite significant, and also because essentially in terms of the numbers of cars on the road in urban areas, heavily populated areas, I think it's probably about time this happens. The taxi unions have actually rejected the idea, saying it would hinder drivers' work. And I think it reflects the system, and there needs to be a system of ensuring that people who are on the roads are actually sound in mind, certainly to be driving on the roads.
It might help, mightn't it? Rolake Akinkugbe, thank you very much indeed for taking us through the papers this morning.